You didn't just burn the bridge, Victoria, you blew up the entire river, entirely forgetting that I owned the ferry. There is a very specific brand of corporate middle manager who doesn't view their department as a team, but rather as a personal feudal fiefdom where they are the absolute, unquestioned monarch. My former manager, Victoria Vance, didn't just run the regional marketing division at Sterling and Cross, she ruled it with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove of aggressive passive aggression. Victoria was the ultimate corporate pick-me, the kind of woman who wore her 70-hour workweeks like a badge of divine martyrdom, constantly sighing in elevators about how nobody wants to work anymore while simultaneously taking credit for every piece of intellectual property her underpaid staff produced. I had been the senior strategist at the firm for 4 years, and during that entire tenure, I had perfected the art of becoming corporate camouflage. I kept my head down, delivered record-breaking campaign metrics, and let Victoria absorb the spotlight during executive presentations. It was a transactional piece. I did the heavy lifting, she got the praise from the C-suite, and in exchange, she left me alone to do my job. My husband, Arthur, who happens to be a forensic data analyst with a mind like a razor blade and a complete lack of patience for corporate theater, often told me I was being entirely too generous. He didn't argue with my patience, he simply monitored the situation with the quiet, detached observation of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. To truly understand how we arrived at a multi-million-dollar showdown in the grand library of a private estate, you have to understand the sheer, agonizing daily grind of working under a woman whose primary talent was corporate parasitism. For 48 months, my corporate existence was a masterclass in psychological tolerance. Victoria Vance possessed an uncanny ability to sniff out brilliance, wrap it in her own branded packaging, and sell it to the high-ranking executives as if she had sweated blood for it. The marketing floor at Sterling and Cross was a pristine, open-concept battlefield of glass partitions, monochrome desks, and high-end espresso machines, but under Victoria's stewardship, it felt more like an psychological panopticon. She spent her days pacing the polished concrete floors, her designer heels clicking with a rhythmic, menacing precision that caused junior associates to instantly minimize their social media tabs and stare intensely at spreadsheets. Victoria had a phrase she loved to use whenever she was about to dump an ungodly amount of work on my desk: "Clara, darling, I'm only giving you this because I trust your attention to detail, but remember, leadership means carrying the burden quietly." Translated from corporate speak, it meant, do this entire project, make sure there are 0 mistakes, and don't you dare mention your name when I present it to Mr. Harrington. I swallowed the bitter pill because the salary was substantial, the health insurance covered Arthur's private medical consults, and honestly, I was playing a long game. I knew that in the corporate ecosystem, true value leaves a paper trail, no matter how hard an insecure manager tries to shred it. The trouble began in earnest during the second fiscal quarter when the agency landed the Vanguard account. Vanguard was the white whale of the luxury hospitality industry, a global conglomerate looking to completely revolutionize their digital brand identity across Europe and North America. It was the kind of account that could make a career or completely obliterate a department if handled incorrectly. The executive board at Sterling and Cross had given our regional division exactly 2 weeks to pitch a comprehensive, cross-platform architecture that would satisfy Vanguard's deeply traditional yet tech-hungry board of directors. The moment the brief landed on Victoria's mahogany desk, she panicked. She didn't understand the intricacies of predictive data modeling, nor did she have the slightest clue how to integrate automated consumer targeting with high-end narrative copy. So, naturally, she did what she always did. She called me into her corner office, which was an ostentatious display of silver-framed degrees, motivational posters about grit, and a constant aroma of expensive lavender oil meant to mask her high-wire anxiety. "Clara," she sighed, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the skyline, her hand draped dramatically across her forehead as if she were a Victorian poet suffering from consumption. "The board has completely dumped this Vanguard pressure on my shoulders. It is simply overwhelming. I love this company, but the vulnerability you feel at the top, some people just don't understand the sacrifice. I need you to put together a preliminary skeleton deck." Just some basic numbers, darling. I will handle the actual strategic visionary work over the weekend. I knew exactly what preliminary skeleton deck meant. It meant she wanted a fully realized, turnkey campaign proposal. I didn't argue. Instead, I retreated to my glass-walled cubicle, plugged in my noise-canceling headphones, and went to work. For 3 consecutive nights, I lived on cold espresso and premium sushi rolls delivered to the empty office at midnight. I built a 90-page architectural masterpiece. I mapped out the entire predictive trajectory of the Vanguard brand, calculated the exact customer acquisition cost down to the penny, and designed a visual narrative template that was, without overstating it, flawless. When I finished the deck on Thursday morning, I uploaded it to our secure shared drive, explicitly saving it with my user profile and adding my name to the metadata authors list. Within 20 minutes, I watched through the glass partition as Victoria's assistant hurried into her office with a fresh cup of matcha tea. A few moments later, Victoria's user profile checked out the master file. The pitch presentation was scheduled for Friday afternoon in the Grand Executive Boardroom on the top floor, a room designed to intimidate, filled with leather-bound chairs, a massive quartz conference table, and a view that made you feel like you were looking down on humanity from Mount Olympus. The entire C-suite was present, including our formidable CEO, Mr. Harrington, a man who possessed the posture of a retired military general and an absolute disdain for fluff. I sat in the back row against the wall, a standard corporate spectator, holding a notepad. Victoria took the floor. She was a vision in a tailored cream pantsuit, her hair pulled back into a sleek bun that practically screamed operational efficiency. She plugged in her laptop, and as the first slide projected onto the massive screen, my stomach did a slow, calculated turn. My name was entirely gone. Every single slide had been reformatted with her personal brand stamp, from the desk of Victoria Vance, Regional Director. For the next 45 minutes, I watched a masterclass in theatrical theft. Victoria didn't just present my data, she acted it out. She walked around the quartz table, her voice dropping into a breathless, solemn whisper whenever she discussed market vulnerabilities, and rising to a triumphant crescendo when she reached the revenue projections. She used metaphors she had stolen from my own project notes, presenting them with an affected humility that made me want to applaud her sheer audacity. "We must look at the consumer not as a target, Mr. Harrington," Victoria said, pausing to look the CEO directly in the eye while resting her hand gently against her pearls, but as a guest arriving at an exquisite estate. "This architecture, which I spent many sleepless nights refining in my study, ensures that the guest never sees the machinery. It is pure, unadulterated narrative luxury." Mr. Harrington nodded slowly, his fingers tapped against his chin, a sign that he was thoroughly impressed. "Brilliant work, Victoria. Truly visionary." The board was skeptical about our regional division's technical capacity, but this structural design is flawless. "You've outdone yourself." Victoria offered a fragile, trembling smile, looking as though she might burst into tears from the sheer weight of her own genius. "Thank you so much, Mr. Harrington. It was an absolute marathon. I practically lived in my office for a month. I love my team, of course, but when you're the only one steering the ship, the pressure can be quite overwhelming. Some people just don't understand the sacrifice required at this level." I sat perfectly still, recording the exact timestamps of her statements in my notebook. Crying without tears is bad for the skin, and Victoria was performing an entire emotional opera without a single drop of genuine moisture leaving her eyes. After the meeting, I left the building quietly and met Arthur at a high-end steakhouse 3 blocks away. The restaurant was dim, smelling of aged wood and expensive Cabernet, a perfect sanctuary from the neon glare of corporate deception. Arthur was already seated in our booth, his tablet propped up against a water glass, his eyes scanning rows of hexadecimal code with a serene, unbothered focus. When I sat down and told him the exact details of the boardroom presentation, he didn't even blink. He reached across the table, took my hand, and gave it a reassuring squeeze before turning his tablet toward me. "Actually," Arthur said, his voice dropping into that smooth, analytical register that always indicated he had already solved the puzzle. Victoria's contribution to that Vanguard deck was entirely cosmetic. While you were walking over here, I ran a routine synchronization check on the subnet files you shared with our home server link. According to the master file's internal history logs, her user profile spent a grand total of 11 minutes inside the document before she checked it back into the main repository. And out of those 11 minutes, 9 were spent using the global replace feature to change the font color from navy to charcoal. She didn't steer the ship, Clara. She sat on the deck in a captain's hat while you rowed from the engine room. I took a slow sip of my wine, letting the rich vintage settle. Let her have the applause for now, Arthur, I replied, a cold, pleasant smile spreading across my lips. Applause doesn't pay the mortgage, but the headhunters certainly do. In fact, we should probably check my LinkedIn inbox. As if on cue, the universe delivered. The Vanguard pitch hadn't just impressed Mr. Harrington, it had sent shockwaves through the local marketing community. Because Sterling and Cross was a public firm, the landing of the account was published on Business Wire networks within an hour. And our primary competitor, Apex Global, had been watching very closely. When I opened my phone, there was a direct message waiting for me from a verified profile, Marcus Vance, Chief Human Resources Officer at Apex Global. The message was concise, professional, and dripping with intent. Clara, we've been tracking your strategic campaign successes for the last 18 months. The Vanguard architecture has your structural signature all over it, regardless of whose name was on the press release. We have an immediate opening for a vice president of digital strategy. Let's talk. The corporate wheels were turning, and Victoria Vance had no idea she had just pushed me out of her kingdom and straight into the executive suite of her worst nightmare. The interview process with Apex Global was a masterclass in executive discretion. Over the next 2 weeks, I moved through their recruitment pipeline like a submarine navigating deep waters. There were no dramatic midday disappearances from my desk at Sterling and Cross, no sudden, mysterious doctor's appointments booked at 2 p.m., and absolutely no change in my productivity. In fact, to keep Victoria completely anesthetized by her own arrogance, I actually increased my output. I handed her 3 separate micro-campaign strategies for our smaller retail accounts, each one meticulously polished so she could easily present them to the upper management as her own quick-witted triumphs. I know exactly what you've done, Victoria, I replied, looking up from my monitor with a serene, unblothered smile. And I assure you, your contribution to my career profile is going to receive the exact level of recognition it deserves. Oh, think nothing of it, she chirped, completely misinterpreting my calm as defeated submission. It's what a good mentor does. We provide the hard truths, even when they're difficult to swallow. Saturday evening arrived, bringing with it the kind of heavy, sweltering summer heat that makes the air feel thick with anticipation. The Henderson estate was located in the exclusive enclave of Oak Ridge Hills, a sprawling, 5-acre property surrounded by ancient, towering oaks and manicured boxwood hedges that looked as though they had been trimmed with surgical scissors. For the annual Sterling and Cross Executive Charity Gala, the grounds had been transformed into a gilded wonderland. Thousands of tiny, warm-toned fairy lights were woven into the branches of the trees, casting a soft, amber glow over the marble pavilions and the massive stone terrace where hundreds of corporate elites mingled. The guest list was a literal directory of power, federal judges, prominent venture capitalists, the entire executive committee of Sterling and Cross, and, of course, the primary stakeholders of Apex Global, whom Beatrice had explicitly invited under the guise of fostering interagency philanthropic cooperation. I stepped out of our private car wearing a structural, floor-length gown of midnight blue silk. It had a sharp, asymmetrical neckline that felt more like armor than evening wear. Arthur walked beside me, looking devastatingly sharp in a custom black tuxedo, his posture relaxed but his eyes scanning the crowd with the quiet, detached observation of an engineer inspecting a bridge before demolition. Are the network bridges stable? I murmured as we ascended the wide marble steps of the terrace. Completely, Arthur replied smoothly, checking his watch. The estate's Grand Library Theater is linked directly to our home server. Marcus Vance arrived 10 minutes ago. He's currently talking with Mr. Harrington by the champagne fountain. Victoria is on the lower lawn, holding court near the jazz trio. We found Beatrice standing near the entrance of the grand ballroom, draped in a magnificent emerald gown and an inheritance worth of diamonds. She was listening to a minor board member drone on about portfolio diversification, looking thoroughly bored until she spotted us. "Ah, Clara, Arthur," Beatrice said, gracefully cutting off the board member with a flick of her fan. "Thank you for finally arriving. I was beginning to think I'd have to endure another conversation about cryptocurrency. Have you seen our guest of honor yet?" "She's downstairs, Mother," Arthur said, offering her his arm. "Wearing enough ruffles to hide a small country." "Excellent," Beatrice murmured, her eyes narrowing with the predatory joy of an old-money matriarch about to engage in blood sport. "Marcus Vance has already briefed me on the creative fiction your manager submitted. I must say, the sheer lack of technical literacy in her fraud is practically an insult to the intelligence of this family. Let's make sure she has a drink before we begin. I prefer my targets to have a false sense of security." We glided down to the lower lawn, where Victoria was indeed holding court. She had arrived 45 minutes late to ensure maximum visibility, wearing a cascading, heavily ruffled champagne dress that looked aggressively like a wedding gown. She was clutching a silver designer evening bag with both hands, using it as a theatrical prop as she gestured wildly to a group of junior executives. "Oh, it's just a matter of operational discipline," Victoria was saying as we approached, her voice carrying across the lawn in that high, breathless register she reserved for public consumption. "The regional division was in absolute shambles before I took the reins. You have to be willing to do the heavy lifting. Some people simply lack the stamina for the upper echelons." "Victoria, darling," I said, stepping into the circle. She turned, her face instantly arranging itself into an expression of profound, performative sympathy that was so loud it immediately drew the attention of the surrounding guests. "Clara. Oh, my sweetness, I am so incredibly brave of you to come tonight. I was just telling Mr. Harrington how worried I am about you. The stress of everything that's been uncovered this week must be absolutely crushing." Mr. Harrington, who had walked over with Marcus Vance, frowned slightly, his glass of vintage champagne tilted. "Uncovered, Victoria? What are you referring to?" "Clara's performance metrics for the Vanguard transition are pristine." Victoria put a trembling, manicured hand over her heart, letting out a heavy, theatrical gasp as if she had accidentally let a state secret slip. "Oh, Mr. Harrington, please. Forget I said anything. I shouldn't have spoken. It's an internal, highly confidential disciplinary matter. I'm handling the data discrepancies and the plagiarism issues privately. I would absolutely hate for Clara's reputation to be ruined publicly before our compliance committee finishes its formal investigation." The surrounding circle of executives went completely silent. Several junior managers took a synchronized step backward, eager to avoid the blast radius of what looked like a career execution. "An investigation?" Arthur stepped forward, his tall frame completely casting Victoria into shadow against the bright pavilion lights. He looked down at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated analytical malice. "That's a fascinating narrative, Victoria. Because according to our family's schedule, the only formal investigation happening tonight is the one we are about to present to the entire executive board in the Grand Library." "The library?" Victoria laughed, a high, strained, a rhythmic sound that lacked any genuine warmth. "Arthur, sweetie, this is a charity gala, not a staff meeting. Let's not bore the board with tedious administrative nonsense." "It isn't nonsense, Mrs. Vance," Beatrice Henderson said, her voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm, judicial register that had once made federal prosecutors turn pale during her late husband's corporate hearings. "Harrington, if you would gather the executive committee and the legal counsel and follow us into the main house, I believe we have a highly relevant presentation regarding the structural integrity of our marketing division. Marcus Vance from Apex Global is already here, and he has a compliance file that requires immediate corporate validation. Victoria's smile didn't just falter, it froze. The performative sympathy vanished from her eyes, replaced by a tight, rigid stillness. She looked toward the stone steps leading to the driveway, but two of Beatrice's private security staff were already subtly positioned near the archways, ensuring the flow of guests moved smoothly toward the grand library. The library of the Henderson estate was a cavernous, three-story room lined with floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves, a massive marble fireplace, and a state-of-the-art projection system used for international charity board meetings. The top executives of Sterling and Cross, including the head of legal, the chief compliance officer, and the CEO, took their seats around the long quartz conference table. Marcus Vance sat at the far end, his tablet open, displaying the automated reference portal logs. Victoria sat near the back of the room, her champagne ruffles rustling loudly in the quiet space. She was still trying to maintain the illusion of a concerned mentor, her face arranged into a mask of polite, slightly bewildered exhaustion as I walked up to the podium at the front of the room. "Clara, really," Victoria murmured, her voice tight and forced. "This is entirely inappropriate. If you are having a psychological breakdown over your career transitions, we should handle this through standard human resources channels on Monday morning. Crying without tears is bad for your skin, dear, and you are making an absolute scene." "I am not crying, Victoria," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the pristine acoustics of the library. "In fact, I haven't been this entertained in years. Arthur, if you please, let's start the slideshow." The room went completely dark, and the massive projection screen descended from the ceiling with a low, mechanical hum. The first slide appeared in stunning, uncropped 4K resolution. It was a massive split-screen image. On the left was the official reference document submitted to Apex Global from Victoria's encrypted corporate account, claiming I had plagiarized the Vanguard campaign architecture and failed to meet client deadlines. On the right was the original project tracking software log from our central server, showing that the campaign architecture had been locked, approved, and stamped with my unique digital signature 3 weeks before Victoria's user profile had even opened the file. "What you are looking at on the left," I explained smoothly, gesturing to the screen like a queen raising a sword, "is a formal reference character assassination submitted by Victoria Vance to prevent my employment at Apex Global. She has claimed, under corporate certification, that I am under active investigation for data theft and incompetence." Mr. Harrington leaned forward, his face hardening into granite. "Victoria, what is the meaning of this? We have no active internal investigation against Clara. Her performance review last month was flawless." Victoria surged to her feet, her silver clutch hitting the edge of the table. "Mr. Harrington, please. This is a complete fabrication. Clara has clearly used her unauthorized access to our digital drives to manipulate these screens. She is a disgruntled employee who is angry because I had to give her constructive criticism regarding her complete lack of leadership potential." "Let's talk about manipulation, then," Arthur's voice boomed from the back of the room as he tapped his tablet. The screen shifted to the second slide. It was a high-resolution display of Victoria's personal corporate laptop directory. The presentation explicitly tracked a step-by-step forensic trail of the graphic editing software she had opened on Thursday night at 8:14 p.m. The presentation explicitly tracked her cursor movements as she cropped out her own messages in the team chat, messages where she had explicitly written, "Clara, your Vanguard proposal is brilliant. I will handle the board submission so you can rest." The screen zoomed in on the edited version she had sent to Apex, where she had deleted her own praise and replaced it with a fabricated reprimand, using a copied font profile from an old HR template. "That was not a professional evaluation, Victoria," I said, looking directly at her as she stood frozen in the middle of the room. "That was a commute. You spent 4 hours meticulously planning a corporate fraud because you realized that without my labor, your regional metrics would collapse by 60% next quarter. This is a lie. Victoria screamed, her voice completely losing its delicate, breathless register and turning into a harsh, frantic screech. Her face contorted with rage as she looked around the room, realizing that the executive board wasn't looking at her with sympathy, they were looking at her with the cold, clinical disgust reserved for an act of liability. Marcus, don't look at that. They've hacked my system. Arthur is a known data meddler. He probably planted those files on my machine remotely. Mrs. Vance, the head of corporate legal for Sterling and Cross, stood up, his voice dropping like an iron anvil into the conversation. An employee's local cache files cannot be modified remotely without leaving an authentication signature from the administrator network, which remains entirely secure. The metadata on these edited files contains your personal biometric login token, timestamped at the exact hour you were logged into the office network from your home IP address. You have utilized corporate resources to commit a fraudulent character assassination against a senior employee, exposing this firm to a massive multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit from both Clara and Apex Global. Victoria's victim mask didn't just slip, it completely shattered, revealing the hollow, bitter insecurity that had driven her entire career. She slammed her silver clutch onto the mahogany table, glaring at me with eyes filled with pure, unadulterated venom. You think you're so smart, Clara, she spat, her breath coming in ragged, uneven gasps as she abandoned the fragile act entirely. You sit there with your perfect little family, your perfect little dresses, and your old money connections, thinking you're better than everyone else. I built that department. I gave 70 hours a week to that company while you just sat back and did the bare minimum. The bare minimum, Mr. Harrington interrupted, his voice dripping with an icy finality that signaled the absolute end of her professional life, consisted of generating 82% of our regional revenue, Victoria. You didn't build that department, you parasitized it. And tonight, the host is rejecting the parasite. Mr. Harrington turned to the Chief Compliance Officer. Terminated immediately for cause. Escort Mrs. Vance from the property, revoke her server access before she leaves this room, and ensure our legal team files a formal corporate fraud report with the licensing board by 9 o'clock Monday morning. Victoria gasped, looking around the table for an ally. She found only a wall of cold, unyielding stares. Even the junior board members were busy taking notes on their tablets, documenting her downfall for the official minutes. Realizing she had completely lost the room, the audience, and her entire career, Victoria grabbed her silver clutch, turned on her heel, and marched toward the side exit of the library. She tripped slightly on her own cascading ruffles as she reached the door, letting out a choked, frustrated sob before slamming the heavy oak door behind her so hard the glass panes in the bookcases rattled in their frames. The silence returned to the room, clean, professional, and refreshing. Beatrice Henderson exhaled slowly, smoothing the front of her designer gown before turning to Marcus Vance from Apex Global. Well, Marcus. Now that the regional marketing division has been thoroughly fumigated of its administrative theater, I believe you have a contract that requires a clean, verified signature from an actual talent. Marcus smiled, sliding his tablet across the polished wood toward me. The offer stands, Clara. In fact, given the exceptional strategic foresight you've demonstrated tonight, the board at Apex has authorized me to increase the signing bonus by an additional 20%. We prefer our vice presidents to know exactly how to handle a corporate ambush. Thank you, Marcus, I smiled, taking the stylus and signing the digital contract with a steady, unbothered hand. I've always found that the best way to handle an ambush is to provide the lighting for the theater. Mr. Harrington raised his glass of champagne toward me from across the table. Our loss is your gain, Marcus. Clara, congratulations. And if your husband ever decides to leave the forensic data sector, tell him our internal audit team pays exceptionally well for a clean autopsy. Arthur wrapped his arm around my waist, his thumb tracing a comforting circle against my silk dress as the room dissolved into polite, professional congratulations. The drama was finished, the corporate fraud had been dismantled, and my new career was officially beginning.